Okay, good morning, everyone. I think you might be starting to join us. And as we have people join the webinar, it'd be great if you could pop your name into the chat and just let us know where you're joining from. Thanks, Carolina. Okay, I can see some people starting to join now. Fantastic. Perth, Christchurch, Melbourne, nice. Mount Eliza, Adelaide, Sydney, few from Sydney. Hi, Werner. Auckland, Melbourne, Sydney. Okay, great. Okay, looks like everyone's starting to come in. Uh, so we might start to kick off. I might just give it about 30 seconds. I can still see some more people joining. Anyway, while a few people catch up and join, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on identifying and developing high potential talent. My name is Jo Stamp and I'm a director here at PBC. I'm based in North Sydney and I'm based on Camaragal land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I've been a director with PBC for nearly 10 years now, and prior to that was also working in the assessment industry for about the last 15 years. I've got a few colleagues here with me today. I've got Carolina Fox, who will be monitoring the chat. So please feel free to drop any comments or questions, anything you like really, into the chat, and we'll be monitoring that, and we will be having time for Q&A at the end of the session. And I'd also like to introduce you to the fabulous Greg Eder, who's joining us from New Zealand. Greg, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. As Jo said, I'm based in Auckland, originally from Christchurch, but lived most of my adult life in Auckland. Apart from a few years, I had about 13, 14 years in Australia, and spent 10 of those living in Melbourne, which is where I came into contact with PBC. And I've been working with PBC for probably 3 years on a permanent sort of basis, and a few years prior to that as an associate. So my background, I'm an organizational psychologist, did my master's 40 years ago now, which is a bit of a scary thought. But a military psych background. Then I've spent most of the remainder of my career going back and forth between consulting firms, doing exactly this kind of work, places like Southern Holdsworth and PwC, and then working in-house for law firms. So I've worked for 4 different law firms. So anybody with that legal background, I can empathize with where you're coming from. So that's probably enough from me. So good to have you all along. Looking forward to this session.
Great, thanks, Greg. Okay, for those of you who may not have worked with the PBC before, we're a human capital consulting business which provides evidence-based people solutions. And we've been in business for over 30 years, providing best practice solutions, maximising the potential and behaviour of individuals, teams, leaders and organisations. We're very proud to be a distributor of Hogan assessments in Australia and New Zealand. And we're also the publisher of the Hogan 360 and the High Performing Team Assessment. PBC as an organisation works across the entire employee life cycle, from selection through onboarding, development, high potential succession planning and executive coaching. And obviously today's session is firmly on high potential talent. So how we identify and develop high potential talent. So today's session, we're going to be speaking to you for about 30 minutes, and we've allowed about 15 minutes for questions. So please feel free, as I said earlier, to pop some questions in the chat. We may cover them as we're going along, or we may leave them till the end. We'll just see how it flows. The agenda for today's session is really to talk through a very simple talent management framework, look at how we define high potential talent, and then how we identify high potential talent, and how we then develop talent using Hogan assessments. And finally, as I said, we'll finish up with some Q&A. So pretty straightforward program. So when I'm working with clients, I find it really helpful to talk through the basic talent management framework that you can see in front of you. I find that often, obviously people know that we work with Hogan assessments, so often I'll get asked for some assessments just to measure talent. And the question that we always go back to is, okay, well, if we're talking about measuring talent, what does talent mean for you? So the first part of the conversation always needs to be around how do you define talent? And then we then look at identifying the most appropriate tools to actually identify talent within an organisation. We often work with clients who may have a high potential program where they've nominated people as talent and they've said, yep, you're high potential, fantastic. And then that's about it. Nothing actually happens with that cohort. So it's really important to talk about and to think about how you actually develop those cohorts and how you keep developing those cohorts that you've identified as great potential for your future leadership in your organisation. And the final part of that framework is to use the data that you've collected to understand what that data shows you about various cohorts, especially obviously your high potential talent cohort, but how that's aligned with your strategy. So we work with clients in looking at their aggregated data across various cohorts. We can look at longitudinal analysis, but also correlating what you've got in terms of your talent with your strategic objectives within the organisation as well. We won't touch on that final analysis point too much today. We'll focus on the first three. So with that in mind, how do we define talent? There's lots and lots of different definitions of talent. These are just a couple. So many of us would know Korn Ferry's K-FALP sort of model, where they look at various different areas of talent and high potential. And on the right, we've got SHL's model of high potential, which looks at ability, aspiration, and engagement. There's a fantastic book called The Talent Delusion, where Dr. Thomas Tomorrow-Premuzic, who was the previous CEO of Hogan Assessments, he wrote a book, and part of that book was dedicated to actually defining talent. And he compared lots of different models of talent, and he found that essentially it sort of boiled down to three things: being rewarding, being able, and being willing. So that sort of engagement piece as well. So organisations will define talent differently or potential differently. And you may have a very tailored definition of talent, which is great, depending on what your particular strategy is. Hogan, though, has, based on some research, has their own model of high potential talent. And it looks like this. So this model was underscored by some work that Luthans did, and it basically identified that it was rare to find individuals who had a combination of strong leadership foundations, so being relatable, being reliable, those sorts of things, who were also able to be effective as leaders, so who were able to build high-performing teams, but also who were able to emerge as a leader. So I'd identified that they were actually different competencies or different traits that successful leaders held, but it actually only existed in about 10% of people. So yeah, only 10% of people actually share strengths across all three of those areas. So that's Hogan's model. And as I said, it really seeks to differentiate between a leader that is emergent. So what we might think of as that more traditional, command and control type leader versus an effective leader. And it really looks at emergent leaders as being really great at managing up, effective leaders at more about managing down and creating those high-performing teams. It also sought to understand the role of persistence and humility, not necessarily traits that were as prevalent in emergent leaders, but actually acknowledging that persistence and humility were actually good leadership traits. And it also identified that politically based processes that are so often present in high potential identification programs tended to identify emergent leaders and potentially overlooked those more effective leaders. So in short, there's lots of different definitions of high potential and talent. Hogan has its own, which we'll focus on today. So once we've identified, or once we've defined what good looks like in terms of talent or high potential, we then need to think about how we actually identify within your organisation who that talent is. And there are, again, lots of different ways that we can do that. One of the most common ways that we probably see still are those manager evaluations. So you may have managers who nominate people for high potential programs. You may have a talent council, for example, that may get together and work with different partners or leaders within the business to speak about who the emerging talent is within the organisation. Organisations are also using other assessment methods like personality assessment, cognitive assessment, work simulations. Organisations look at biographical measures, so past experiences. They might do behavioural interviews. And some are also obviously looking at performance metrics, so who achieves their KPIs within the business. What you'll notice about those is a lot of those are actually more performance-based. So how they're actually performing in their current roles as opposed to how they will perform in future roles. Which brings us to the old 9-box grid, which I'm sure you have all seen many of in your workplaces. When I did a little bit of a Google, there were lots and lots of 9-box grids that we could find. And, this is something that is used a lot, and it brings up an important concept that performance is different to potential. So with us at PBC and Hogan, we actually differentiate between those two things. So performance is really more of a lag indicator. Performance obviously measures current behaviours and can often be biased or politicised. And in terms of Hogan's model, it tends to focus more on that emergent leader capability set, as opposed to potential, which is more of a lead indicator. It identifies those future behaviours and it's able to measure both effectiveness and ability to emerge, and can also minimise bias and adverse impact on that identification process. Ideally, you're going to have measures of both when you're identifying your high potential talent. So to start with identifying potential, I'm going to pass over to Greg, who's going to talk about how we identify potential at PBC.
Okay, thanks, Jo. So yeah, you can see here we've covered the core, if you like, the flagship tools that we use. So we've got the Hogan Personality Inventory, which looks at the bright side. This is a model of personality. It's based on the 5-factor model. So for those of you that haven't been formally trained in the Hogan tools, it looks at day-to-day behaviour. It's what we see most of the time when everything's going pretty well. Then we've got the Hogan Development Survey, and this is perhaps one of the tools that really is quite unique to Hogan. It differentiates or separates what we offer from a number of other providers, and it looks at dark side behaviours, what we sort of tongue-in-cheek call dark side. But these behaviours start out as strengths, but it's the overuse of those strengths that causes problems. The confident manager who gets overconfident, cocky, arrogant. And then we've got the inside, which is the motives, values, preferences inventory, which looks at if you like, the ideal self, the kind of world that somebody wants to create. So when you put those things together, you've got the inside telling us a bit about how somebody likes to operate, why certain things are important to them, the bright side of the strengths that they bring to the table. And to a certain extent, the dark side also highlights the strengths, but it also highlights where those strengths can be overused or underused, and that can cause subsequent problems. Then, of course, you've got cognitive reasoning ability, so ability to think, and this looks at intellectual capacity. So the high potential report that we'll have a look at shortly draws on the first three of these, the three personality assessments that you can see here. So should we go into the next slide, Joe? So with that in mind, how do we then look at developing talent? So if we go to the next slide as well, what we believe is that there are two sources of potential interest here. So the focus of today revolves largely around the why. So using the HPI, the HGS, and the MVPI to generate and develop the high potential report. We'll also touch on the what, which is the Hogan High Potential 360. So the why tells us about the underlying personality characteristics. You know, why does somebody do certain things? Why do they behave in certain ways? And the what tells us at this particular point in time, what are they doing? How does that why play out in reality? So as I said, we've got the three personality questionnaires that we've done quite a lot of research looking at how different aspects of these three questionnaires factor into the high potential report. We've subsequently developed the high potential 360, which is based on the same characteristics as the characteristics that we cover off in the high potential report. So, but we're using elements from each of the HPI, the HGS, and the MVPI to develop the high potential report. So if we go to the next slide, we can see there, why is the Hogan assessment good for high potentials? Joe mentioned before, sometimes these decisions can be quite political. So this helps temper that political element and balance it with some of the science, the data, but a bit more rigor and a bit more system in terms of how people are selected, how they're identified. It helps remove any unfair bias that might exist around gender, racial, ethnic groups, any other demographics that can get in the way. And most of you who are Hogan trained will know that Hogan go to a lot of effort to make sure that there is no undue bias. And this applies especially to the HPO as well, the high potential report too. The obviously too, the ability to be able to create a globally applicable solution. So we're using the default option for the report is global norms. It helps you focus on prioritizing the behavioral change that's associated with particular scores in the report. And then ultimately look at ways to close those gaps and create readiness for new roles. So the report itself. So the first couple of pages you can see here, we've got obviously the cover page on the left. The right-hand page is just an overall summary page. So this is generic. It describes the model that Joe's touched on. So if we go to the next slide, here we can see some more detailed information. So the first page on the left is where we've got the executive summary. So you can see in the top right-hand corner of the page on the left, we allocate ratings, a color-coded rating scheme to let people know where they sit in regards to each of the competencies. So a high score, which is in the green, is scores over the 65th percentile, so 66th percentile and above. Above average scores are scores between the 51st and 65th percentile. Below average between the 36th and 50th percentile, and then low scores anything under the 35th percentile. So that's the color coding piece that you can see there. Then if you look into the middle band, you can see that there's also a number in each box. And the number in each box is the ranking of the competencies. So you can see, I can't quite read this, it's too small for me. Oh no, getting along, the bottom left one is the highest ranked competency across the spectrum. And you can see the lowest ranked, I think that's leading people on the bottom right. And then the very bottom, the recommendation focus talks about, one of our philosophies is to leverage strengths. So that's why we see those the first top three scoring competencies on the left, And then obviously the areas of focus for this person sitting in the bottom 3 ranked competencies. On the right-hand side of the screen, this is where we start to get into detail. So you can see there you've got the competency, a following process, you've got the color coding, and then the ranking in the top band. Then for each of the competencies, what we've done, what Hogan have done, is there are the top 3 scales from across the HPI, HDS, and MVPI have been allocated to each of the competencies. So for following process, you can see the first 2 of those are prudence and dutiful. If we had more detail there, you'd be able to see that following process, the other one would also be tradition. So, and with these, you get to see the score, the percentile score. As I think I mentioned before, that the default percentile is the global norms. So you see their prudence score sitting at the 72nd percentile, their dutiful score sitting way down there and is at the 5th percentile. And then underneath talks about some of the pros and the cons associated with those particular scores, and then some developmental tips. And these pages are all tailored according to the scores. So there would be, in the full report, you'll also get the next page would be the one that covers off the tradition score. So that's the content of the report. So a lot of detail that's available. So looking at each of the 3 areas, so leadership foundations revolves around these 3 elements of being able to follow process, think broadly, and get along. So basically, these are kind of the underlying foundations for being a good organizational citizen, how somebody manages their career, their ability to get things done, think broadly, keep an open mind, and get along with others. So that's the basis of the foundations domain. Then we've got emergence. And this is about how people stand out, how they can influence each other, and how they can build connections. This is, as Joe said, this is an important element of the model, because it helps differentiate between the emergent leaders and then also, as we'll see, the actual leader themselves in terms of their effectiveness. And some of you may be familiar with the work of Marshall Goldsmith, who's written a book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. So this kind of builds on that similar theme that, sometimes people can be very good at promoting themselves. So that leadership emergent, those qualities, they really can stand out, gets them to the point, but then what have they got once they get there? Because what we're saying here is that there are a different set of skills at this level that leaders also need to be fluent in. So their ability to lead the business, manage resources, get things done still, as well as lead people. So you can see here that the core element of this is around leading the business and leading people. So, all right, I'll hand back to Joe. Oh, you're on mute, Joe.
Sorry, trying to find my mute button. Thank you. Thanks, Greg. So that's the personality-based report. And you can see it's got a real development focus. So no matter what sort of definition of talent you're using, it can really help you to work with your high potential cohort to understand what their areas of strength are and understand where those gaps are and build out a development program for them. In terms of the report, being a Hogan report, it comes with a lot else. So there is an online, for those of you who are certified already in the Hogan personality assessments, you have to be certified to use this report. But there's also an additional online qualification specifically for the Hypo report, and that's complimentary. It takes about 45 minutes to complete that online qualification, and it's available through the Hogan LMS, which you would have had access to when you did your Hogan certification. The thing I really like about the Hypo report is that there are some facilitation resources. So, it's not that common that people work with an individual, person who's been identified as a high potential talent. You're often working with a cohort. So there are facilitation materials available to support the that hypo cohort. So there's things like a career development workshop, there's facilitation materials, there's debrief materials with development planning exercises. You would have seen in the report that Greg just went through that there are lots of development tips throughout the report as well. There's also a behavioural interview guide, which again is help to sort of flesh out some of those development interventions. And of course, you know, being Hogan, there's a full technical manual available as well. So once you go through that complimentary online qualification, you can access all of those additional resources. And we will be sending an email with the link to the qualification webinar after the session today. So Greg's taken us through the why, so that underlying personality and, you know, the underlying personality that drives those behaviours that you're likely to see in your high potential talent. I'm just going to talk briefly now about the what, so how we actually identify those measurable behaviours at a specific point in time. And we do that through a Hogan 360 tool. And we have, when Hogan released the High Potential Talent report, we went to work and actually developed a High Potential 360 to use exactly the same model that Hogan uses. So if any of you are familiar with our standard Hogan 360, it's uses a 7-point scale. So it has rate on scale items. It has those unique strengths and opportunities tables in the middle of the report, and then it has the free text commentary. So standard sort of format 360 report in terms of a Hogan 360 report. It's just got some additional items, and they're all grouped under those 3 core themes of leadership foundations, leadership emergence, and leadership effectiveness. Again, yeah, we have global benchmarks, so all of those items are benchmarked against a global population, as you can see down at the bottom here on the left. In terms of the report itself, you get a lot of detail. I won't go into all of the detail, but again, you'll get scores across each of those 3 theme areas. Why we would use the High Potential 360 alongside the personality assessment. If you are working with a high potential cohort, the High Potential 360 is going to give you a very actionable place to start in terms of coaching or development planning with an individual. It tells you actually how they're behaving at this particular point in time. The underlying personalities through the High Potential Talent report, the Hogan Personality Report, is going to give you a lot of information about why those behaviours are coming through. So it gives you a lot more to work with. The High Potential 360 report is also repeatable. So you get to actually measure that return on investment from your high potential development program as well. Again, similar to the personality version of the model, we provide a complimentary online qualification in the High Potential 360. It takes about an hour, and we also provide a development guide, a feedback guide, an interpretive guide, and we provide a technical manual, again, just so that you can ensure that you've got that the rigour that sits behind both of the personality-based report and the 360 report. And finally, I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but in terms of some of the best practices that we see in organisations that we work with, it's making sure that the definition of talent is linked to your strategy. Where is your organisation going? What is the future state of your organisation, and how are you linking your definition of talent to that strategy? Trying to move towards evidence-based and unbiased selection processes. We work with lots of organisations who are just not there yet. And it's really, you know, some of the work we've done is even just working on standardising some of those manager evaluation processes so that they're actually measuring the right things and that there's actually some standardisation. And then down the track, maybe we'll get to some, you know, some more psychometric assessment. Using data to inform development programs for both individuals and cohorts. So starting with something like a 360 or the personality-based report gives you a really great place to start. It can target your development interventions and can really accelerate that development process as well. And obviously it's great to get that that aggregated data across a cohort so that any sort of group development programs can again be informed by what the gaps are for that cohort. We see that having that global or at least C-suite exposure for your talent coming through your organisation is vital, and also those the diversity of experiences that your cohort are being involved in. So things like strategic projects and rotational assignments is really vital to actually building out that experience and that diversity of thought for your cohorts. As always, we recommend mentorship and executive coaching. And again, starting with those data-informed development planning can really accelerate that coaching intervention. And continuous learning and feedback. It's not just a set and forget. You actually have got, it's that continuing sort of investment in your future leaders, so that you can retain them and engage them, and they stay and deliver for the organisation in the future. I'm going to take a breath, and I think we are at exactly 30 minutes. So I'm going to pause here and open it up to the floor for any questions.
Hey, Jo and Greg, thanks for that so far. I've been keeping an eye on the chat. So we've got a couple. One from Joseph that was sent through was, how do you tie back the Hogan assessment results to the 9-box grid for talent review purpose? Or what other models have you seen that might work?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off, and then Greg, you might jump in. But yeah, so I would, so in terms of a 9-box grid, I'd probably, the challenge with a 9-box grid is that you identify people who've who have potentially got great potential, and are also great performers, and then you put them into a box, and it's really, that's great. And so obviously you can use, you can rank your results from the personality assessments to get your potential result, and you can use your results from a 360 to get your performance result, or you can use other measures like KPIs, manager ratings, those sorts of things to give you that performance result, and then you can plot them. 9-box grids are great just to help you understand who you've got within your cohort, but for me it's more about so what next, what do you do with them then? And that's where I think the reports that you've seen today can be really great in actually supporting that ongoing development, because we hear from so many organizations, yep, we've identified talent, now what do we do? So it's the what's next is really important. But yeah, absolutely, you can use personality assessments for the potential axis, the 360 for the performance axis.
Awesome. Hillary had a question as well. I'm curious about the cognitive ability aspect of hypermeasurement. Is it contradictory to the growth mindset research that's around, that says effort and growth mindset is more important and that IQ is not fixed?
Greg, that's firmly for you.
I can comment on that. Yeah, it might have confused you that we'd included cognitive in that earlier slide, because the cognitive assessment's not actually part of the high potential report. So the high potential report is based entirely on the HPI, the HTS, and the MVPI. So the personality assessment, and I would agree that, I think you need to be careful with cognitive assessments. There are plenty of people who might do, fairly mediocre cognitive results, but whenever I see cognitive results for those clients that do use them, the first thing I do is go and look at their personality profile, because that tells us a lot about how people use their intellect. There are plenty of people with what might be defined as more average intellects who perform exceptionally well because they're disciplined, hardworking, they're highly motivated. There's a whole range of other personality characteristics that actually drive their success. Sometimes very high intellect can get in the way. But anyway, I don't want to digress, but I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Greg. Lauren just asked, are the hypo assessments tailorable to internal leadership capability frameworks? Maybe Jo?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So not really. So if we were going to be, if you had a very defined, specific sort of model of what, a specific set of criteria, I guess, or capabilities that you are looking for from your high potentials, we'd actually probably be wanting to map the broader Hogan assessments to to what your definition of good is. So, as you know, with the Hogan assessments, they are they give you a very broad view of personality. So we've got a lot to work with. The High Potential Talent Report is great. And there's some great research behind it, but it's a specific lens, or it's a specific model that we're measuring against. Yes, we're using the assessment data, but it's kind of been passed through that model as a lens, to give you the report output. So if you've got a different model of what high potential looks like, then we'd probably actually be more likely to map that model. However, I've got a case study that I might speak to just quickly, which showed us how we worked with the Hypo report and sort of a slightly different definition of high potential. I worked with it was a government agency, and they were wanting to really uncover. They were wanting to do a couple of things. They were wanting to identify who their talent was at a specific level within the organisation. So it was quite a large scale program in the first instance. Then they were wanting from those that they identified had those capabilities or were more likely to demonstrate those capabilities that they were looking for in their future leaders. They then wanted to invest in very targeted development for them. So in this case, we actually mapped the Hogan competency model. So it's a set of 62 competencies. We mapped that model to their definition of talent, and we identified a set of competencies that they then and we used one of the Hogan tools, Configure, which is a competency-based tool. We used that model, which uses the HPI and the HDS, to assess quite broadly across that level, so that we're able to identify any sort of hidden talent, basically. And then we worked with them to rank those people. There was a little bit of calibration that went into that. And then they actually invested in the High Potential Talent Report as that development tool to support the development of those that they had identified as talent. So it was a bit of a combination of both. So that's just an example of how you might pull them in together.
Great. Another question from Aaron, does the client always need to have their own definition of talent?
No. That's
why.
Yeah. It helps to sort of think about what you're looking for. But that's part of the reason why Hogan have done the research, is to actually say we've actually looked at what high potential talent can look like. And that's why they've got, that report and that sort of model there. So yeah, if you don't have your own model, then you can certainly use ours.
We've got another question from Hilary. I'm curious on your thoughts about the age-old debate of whether to advise or not to advise hypos, as this can, of course, change over time. And if people are advised, there may be an unintended consequence of avoidance of risk.
Yep. It is a challenge. Greg, do you want to kick off? I'm happy to, but
yeah, well, yeah, my first thought is that if you're going to advise, you need to follow through.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest risk with advising people that they're in that high potential group, is then not acting on it. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with all of the potential, ups and downs of advising and not advising. So I don't want to kind of lecture you on that. But I think from my perspective, the key is that if you're going to advise, you need to act on it. And I guess the other advantage is that it provides something aspirational for others who may want to get in the pool. And maybe it's also a little bit about, well, if people aren't in that high potential pool, do we have a bigger pool that we could still provide support to, so that those people who want to get into the high potential pool can find ways of getting there. And so maybe that's something else to be thinking about.
Yeah, the other so the other thing I guess we're seeing more and more is it's not just organizations are more and more also identifying other sorts of talent, I guess. So it's not just necessarily about being the future strategic leaders in an organization. It might actually be identifying those that might be leaders in terms of their technical expertise or functional area sort of leaders, those sorts of things. So while they may demonstrate different capabilities from your potential leaders of your business, it still gives you an opportunity to develop people in a targeted way for different types of development. So yeah. The other thing I was going to say on that is also again, an argument for measuring, not just basing sort of decisions about your talent cohort on measures of existing performance, because again, to Greg's point, what's got them there is not necessarily going to get them to the next level. So, that measurement of potential can actually help to understand who's got those, who's more likely to demonstrate those capabilities that you need in the future, not just how they're performing now. And I can see that the question there from Ruth as well. Yes, it's a Hogan model. It's not a PBC model. And we can share the what process research was used to develop it. Yep, it's all in the, there is a technical manual. Greg, do you want to give a quick summary? I know you've looked at this.
I can. Yeah, so what Hogan did initially was they formed an expert panel who provided some insight into this sort of model around foundations, emergence, and effectiveness. They then conducted a job evaluation exercise, which is quite a sophisticated competency-based assessment of what people think make effective leaders at different levels. There was a number of statistical, analytical work, a lot of meta-analysis done, which is a statistical technique that pulls data out. Drew on lots of the research that Hogan have done, the criterion reference research that they've done. So it's quite a sophisticated approach statistically, but it's all contained in the technical manual. So for those of you that are inclined to want to understand how all of that got there, there's loads of information, as is the case with everything Hogan do. So yeah.
Awesome. We'll squeeze in another question, maybe for Greg. Can you talk to some of the scales that are attached to those 3 competencies?
I can, although at the risk of it could get boring if I just went through and listed them all.
Maybe not all.
But yeah, so what Hogan did was they've looked at both. So they identified the top 3 scales that showed the strongest relationship to each of the competencies. So for instance, the example, I think the example we were looking at, I can't remember which one it was. It might have been building. No, it was following processes, which had prudence, dutiful, and tradition. For all of the scales, there'll be at least one. There's always one scale in most cases, there's one scale from the HPI, one from the HTS, and one from the MVPI. There's a couple of occasions where you might have, say, 2 HTS scales and 1 MVPI scales. But again, all of that's contained in the technical manual. So there's plenty of you'll know which scales are attached. One of the things that we didn't mention that we often encourage people to do is if you're a trained user, we have a package deal where you can get the hypo report as well as the flash report. And that gives you, which from the report, which scales are linked to the particular competency in the model, but you can also dig into some of the detail and the nuance that you get by looking at the subscales associated with those main scales. So that's a really useful add-on for the qualified users. So in other words, anybody who's has already done the Hogan assessments, we can generate a report without them having to do it again, although you'd want to think about the currency of their results in making that decision. So
Great. They look like all the questions we have for today, so I'll let you guys close off.
Thanks, Carolina. Okay, so that's it for today. I think we've managed to 1 minute to spare, so short and sweet. If you have got any questions, you've got our details. By all means, connect with us on LinkedIn, drop us an email. The team will be out to you with an email that will have links to both the qualification webinars and the sample report, so you can have a little bit of a look. But yeah, any questions, by all means, give us a buzz, and thanks everyone for joining. It was great to see you.
Yeah, bye from me.
Thanks, Greg.